I did just want to mention briefly, in 2016, before we started the Data Curation Network, the whole idea of this project was really born out of a conference just like this, with about 3 other colleagues of mine. One of them is sitting right there, over margaritas at a Mexican restaurant. So the fact that we're going to a Mexican restaurant tonight, I think is going to really bode well, and I think margaritas is the key to success in all of data curation. Again, I was just pointing my colleague, Cynthia Hassan-Vitali. We're here to represent a much larger group of people that I will actually show you some images and names of in a minute, so I won't list them all. But we have been working on this project for those many years and have a lot of stories to tell. But first, let's just revisit that why question, and I really don't think I need to go into too much detail here. But our stance is quite a practical one, and that's really just through our experience of working with researchers that are needing to share their data beyond its original purpose. So we're looking at repositories, both institutional repositories, but also a general data repository. And the data that we see and that come to us are not always in their best shape. So they are messy, they may lack context, they are in file formats that are always at risk, and sometimes they just are left for many years and just neglected, so we need to revive them. Just to give you a little evidence behind that statement, which I think all of you can relate to, we did do a study, I believe this was back in 2017, of just a 6-month period of data sets that came through our repositories, and 47% of them had no documentation at all. So really just the file itself was the one being published, or the one that was being deposited into the repository. So if left alone, they would have no documentation without any curatorial interaction. We also did a number of focus groups where we talked to researchers. We asked them, what curation activities are important to you? What are the things that really need to happen for you and your data? And not surprisingly, most of the data curation activities that we posed to them, there were 47 in total, were important. Researchers recognized those things as important. Unfortunately, though, the most important activities for research data were not always happening. So we held those focus groups and we asked them, does this actually happen for your data? And there were a number of very important things that did not happen. And so we saw this as an opportunity for really improving in the lives of researchers, to really interject some of these activities and processes into areas that might not just be occurring at all. The other question we asked them, okay, so if it is happening for your data, are you satisfied? And there again, we see an opportunity because a lot of the very important activities were not happening in satisfactory ways. So researchers might be creating documentation, but they're just not really happy with the results, or not really understanding what to do to make it better, or they really did not see a path forward towards quality assurance of their data, or other skills and procedures that us in the data curation community could provide. So we saw a clear opportunity there for those of us who were working with researchers in the repository land to really shift from skills and activities that we thought were important as archivists and as librarians toward skills and activities that our researchers really felt were important. And that is what the data curation really was based on. So this is how we're defining data curation, and these are some of the steps that we take. So when we're working with a data set, data curation activities include finding and adding missing files, creating additional documentation, screening for privacy and disclosure risk, not just trusting that somebody checked the box to say there's no personally identifiable information, actually testing that theory out. Detecting and fixing code issues, quality assurance issues in the code, whether or not it will run in our environment versus their computer. Transforming those files for long-term access, making decisions about what does that transformation actually do to the file? Does it impact the data in any way? Does it impact the usability in any way? Arranging and describing the files to provide it context, to really showcase the information that is there, to publish the data that looks presentable and useful. And then reviewing and augmenting metadata. And I intentionally put that last because I feel like there's, of course, a lot of really great metadata standards out there. But we in multidisciplinary repositories, we can't focus just on the metadata standards because we're dealing with all different types of data. So sometimes the metadata augmentation is a little maybe superficial. We're just cleaning up that metadata a little bit just to ensure interoperability with the rest of the data sets in our collections. We're not just doing this for ourselves. We obviously have to look at the bigger picture. So curators aren't just hoarding data and this is great data. I can never replicate that laugh again in my life, by the way. That's really weird. But we are underlying a much larger mission here, and that is to, of course, support the repositories that we work for, they're providing the technical capacities to publish these data sets, to make them findable, to make them discoverable. So of course, there's a lot of infrastructure in place to expose all the metadata and to broker that metadata to a lot of really great sources. And they are supporting researchers who are not only our depositors, but also our users of data. So the researchers, there's a credibility issue that repositories have to really interact with researchers and ensure that we are making sure that their data is trustworthy and fair. And then, of course, the public, that broader access piece, that we are ensuring that anybody can potentially gain access to data. It might not be open all the time. Maybe there's a process to go through. Maybe there are certain conditions you have to meet first. But we're serving that broader community. Serving that broader community is fraught with many challenges. So again, pulling from some research that we've done, we did a study of Association of Research Library Institutions and asked them, what are the barriers to providing data curation services? And the number one barrier, and all of them were barriers, by the way, but they were all considered very challenging, or mostly challenging, at least for the majority of our participants here. But expertise in curating domain data was one of the major challenges, the most challenging. And then, of course, scaling with increased demand. And these are very common issues, I think, that the Data Curation Network in particular has been trying to better understand in order for us to tackle. So with that, I will turn over to what we are actually doing. So the Data Curation Network is right now we're a grant-funded project. We're funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and we are a community of librarians, of repository managers, of administrators in academic organizations that are really trying to come together and ensure that researchers can share their data in ways that are ethical and very usable, reusable. Right now we have 10 partner institutions. These are all US-based institutions, and 9 of them are academic universities. They are pretty homogeneous in the sense that they are large, well-funded academic research institutions. We also have Dryad, which is the general data repository that Aaron worked for. We're be really sad after moving Aaron's name there. Maybe I won't have to. And so this group has been coming together to really share expertise. And I guess this is the main point I want to give everybody to take away. We're not just a best practices community, although we definitely talk about best practices, but functionally, we curate each other's data. Each one of the people on this screen have a different expertise. They have PhDs in different domains and disciplines. They have amazing skill sets in different software and programming languages. And when I receive a data set that comes to my repository that is a chemical spectra file or is an R file, I personally cannot curate that data set as well as somebody else in our network who has that skill set and that expertise. So right now we've got 28 data curators that cover 43 domains and 26 specialty file types. The history here, we started the planning phase in 2016, as I mentioned. Margarita's. The planning phase, that included some of that research where we interviewed all of our focus group researchers about their needs, and then we published this model. And the Data Curation Network model is a very theoretical framework for how would we do this. And I'm happy to say today we're actually implementing that model. So with another funding phase from the Sloan Foundation to do the implementation phase, we actually went live in January 1st of this year. So we've been curating each other's data sets since that time, after months and years, I guess, of planning and training. We do annual trainings for all of our curators. We put a system in place to track all of the data sets that go through the network, to monitor time tracking and all that. So that is all in place, and we are growing. At each one of these steps, we've been incrementally and intentionally adding new members to really try to expand and to test that relationship, really, because it's pretty easy to get a group of your close buddies and say, let's do this together, but to really scale and to really expand and to build up that group, and it's quite fascinating. So for the rest of the talk, and I have no idea how long I'm talking, but hopefully someone will flag me down, thank you, it's really going to focus on our vision. And we did a pretty extensive visioning process to identify what do we want to be. How do we want to really grow this project? So for each one of these areas, we have a vision for what we want to do under each of those particular areas. And so I'll just spend a little bit of time describing each of those. So the first is, of course, data curation. This is the doing. This is the actual curation work that we do for one another, because we feel that having a broad set of expert curators to curate our data is just we are going to be able to curate data better by relying on each other. And in fact, I could never hire all the experts that I would need for my institution, so this is really the only way we're going to be able to do it. One of the things that we use in our training and in our work are these curate steps. So this is something that the group created early on when we analyzed all of the different important data curation activities that researchers wanted, but we also needed a baseline. We needed to know what's the minimum steps that everybody needs to take if you're curating something to our data curation network standards. And this is what we use in our training program, for which Cynthia and I gave a 2.5-hour version of earlier today, where we really walk people through sort of this step, because we need to have a normalized process where we can all kind of rely on one another to be doing the same things, at least at this very basic level. And this is our process overall. And one thing I want to say about the process here, so this first layer is the local institutional layer. And we did a number of pilots early on in the data curation network, and we found that the local institution really needs to retain a lot of control over what happens to the data. We don't want the data curation network to be interfering or interjecting itself into anything policy related, and actually not too much related to infrastructure and technology as well. We wanted the data curation network to be the human layer in your data repository service. So in this instance, we've got data that's coming into the local institution, and they make the decisions about ingest, they make the decisions about appraisal, about selection, and then they are also responsible for facilitating access to long-term storage preservation. So they're doing a lot of the repository functions. The other important thing to note here is that the data curation network is technology agnostic. So we really want to work, and we do work, with any technology platform, because those platforms will come and go. They are decided based on a lot of decisions, not just is this the best fit for me, but maybe this is the right thing for us because we develop in this language. So we needed to kind of stay below that layer. And below that layer, let's go, is the data curation network. And this is our coordination process. So we have a coordinator position in the DCN. who reviews all incoming data sets that have been selected for submitting to the DCN. And I should mention, not all data sets from a local institution come down to us. They might have the local capacity to curate or something else. But when they do, we review them for the domain and the file type, and we assign it to the appropriate person in the network, depending on their availability, which is another consideration and difficult to track. They go through those curate steps that I mentioned earlier, where they are checking the files, understanding the file types, and they're applying a lot of domain-based decisions around the actual file type itself. So these check steps and these curate steps actually take place in a different way depending on the data that comes in. So, and I'll talk a little bit about how we do that in a second. Once they're complete, they reply, they send the data set back, they send the submission or the assignment back to the coordinator and say, here's what I'd recommend. Here are all the steps that I would take to ensure that this data is reusable and fair. Then that is passed back to the local curator. And I'm going through that rigorous process with you today because I want to just make the point that we didn't want to remove the local connection between the curator and the researcher, because that is something that we at each of our institutions value. We really see that as a great opportunity to create a relationship with those local authors and ensure that those connections stay strong. So we didn't want somebody else from Michigan interfering in our process. So by doing it this way, we've really been able to protect those relationships, and I think it's been working really well. The final step is to really ensure that we are evaluating that overall process. So we have weekly stand-ups where the curators come together and talk about, this is what I did for this actual curation. Like, I received a report, here's what I took back to the researcher, and here's what they actually did. And so that's really kind of the most exciting point in the process, where you can see the impact of our work and you can see that final result come to fruition. The tools we use, so I mentioned the data sets come in. They come in to us via Jira. We're using Jira software as our time tracking software management tool. And that's been working really well for us. We pretty much highly customized it, I think I would say, for all of the ingest forms and how it walks through the Kanban board of all the processes and the information that we're collecting. We also use WordPress for our website, where we are really promoting all the data sets that come through our network and talking about the curation steps that have happened. That's really a part of our role for trying to advocate for this should not just be a hidden process. This is something that we want to share and make known. And then we build community through our Slack channels and our listserv, and our curators are also talking about best practices and really trying to share new ideas or new examples that they come across. So we've been doing this for about 6 months now, and this just gives you kind of a confusing example, but I'll try to walk through it. In yellow, these are the submitted data sets per type, and then in blue, these are our experts. So eventually, one day, the yellow is going to far outstrip the blue, because our experts are kind of, going to remain a little static, but the number of data sets are going to keep going up. So I don't know how long I can use this slide, but at least it gives you an idea of where the types of data coming in are aligning with our skill sets, or maybe where there is a missing area. I don't know what that other is actually. I should look it up. But we've only curated about 58 so far. And we're working on processes to make it easier for institutions to send something to the Curation network, because there is a time lag involved. You are sending it to another person. There is a communication time lag of actually getting the assignment accepted by the curator. The turnaround times, I've got another slide here on turnaround times, but we try to make assignments successful within 24 hours. So we'll ping the curator and say, can you do this? And hope to get an answer back within 24 hours to keep that process going. The median turnaround time, so the completion for one of our curators, is about 3 days. Each data set, the curation time for the curator is about 2.5 hours. I think that's what we're averaging right now. But that turnaround time, of course, is going to be longer. And then everybody is reaching, in their due dates, but I wanted to just point out that if you have a due date that's further out, you'll see our curators are waiting until that due date to finish it. So lesson learned here, keep your due date short. But that's not always possible either, because if you make it too short, then we wouldn't be able to get it back to you, as we know with the Dryad. Then I mentioned the website, and this is something we've been experimenting with a lot, and I'd really love to hear from the community about this. We want to make the curation process a little bit more transparent, but it's hard because we don't want to throw the researchers under the bus. So we don't want to spell out, this data set was horrible, and you can't believe all the things we had to do to it. But we also, want to say, wait, we did do stuff to it. So we're experimenting with just having kind of the generic curation services that were done for each individual data set kind of listed without going into too many specifics, and then you can link to the final result. And then something else we're really, really interested in is highlighting the role of the individual curator. Really celebrating the professional aspects of this is a person who is entered into this field and has an amazing set of skills that you're not going to find anywhere else. And we need to ensure that we're giving all of the carrots, I guess, was mentioned earlier, for these individuals to continue to participate in this profession. So that idea of how do we recognize, how do we celebrate, how do we increase the professionality of the data curation as a job, as a role. All right, and this is one way we're also doing that. Oh, that's such a good segue. So one of the things the Data Curation Network has been doing for the last 2 years is offering workshops beyond our own group. So we've got 28 curators, we've trained them all in, everything's going great. How can we make sure that other people are also getting access to some of this information? And one of the ways we're doing that is through these specialized data curation workshops. So Cynthia Hudson-Vitale is the PI of this particular grant, and this is a program funded through the IMLS, Institute of Museum and Library Services in the United States. And we've taught 2 workshops, technically 3 workshops so far. We did one before the grant started. To bring together the community, and is that you, Leah? Do you see yourself? Several people in the room have actually come to these workshops, but it's been a great opportunity to, again, come together and collaborate and better understand how we can increase the abilities for us as a community to curate data more efficiently. These are just the learning outcomes. You'll see an emphasis here on building up network and building community. And that's certainly something that we've been doing through our primer outputs for these workshops. So this is just an example from the last one of the way that the 2 days is broken down. So it's a day and a half. It's a very hands-on event. We have the check steps that we go through. So we do a little bit of lecture on every step in the curation process, including the curated steps. So D is the document step there at the end. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier. And then we have 5 different data sets that we've been working with. So the room actually groups up around one of these particular data types, and each data type produces its own set of challenges. And the group working from the curate steps and the checklist really goes into much more specific details about how you would treat the survey data differently than you would the tabular data. And this is just a few of the examples of the data sets that we review. There we go, lots of great examples. Okay. So far, we've had 2, as I mentioned. So workshop number 1 was a year ago in Las Vegas. We have an application process. We've been receiving about 50 applicants per session, but we only have funding for 25 attendees for each session. So we've been having to cap that off. We've got another workshop coming up in a couple weeks. And the outcomes of each of these workshops are listed here, and I'll share out what these are. This has been the most exciting thing, I think, for us, is to really see the data curation resources coming out of these trainings. So we're not just training people, we're actually mining them for information and positioning them to publish everything that they know, because our community knows a lot about all of the different data types. So one of the greatest examples, I think, of our outputs has been these primers. So data curation primers, it's a concise, actionable resource meant to assist data curation, adding value to a data set. We've got them loaded into GitHub, and each one is it's created from attendees that come to the workshop. They get together in groups at the session. So we'll actually have everybody pitch a primer, and then the primers that get a lot of plus ones will actually be minted into a group. Each one of those groups is assigned a mentor. One of the co-PIs on the grant is a mentor, because we're going to ask them to meet monthly over a 6-month period to actually write and develop the primer. So there's a fair bit of research that goes into these. There's a fair bit of experience that goes into these. We also have stipends if people want to interview researchers to really add the value to the data set, or to the primer. They are peer reviewed by our community and then published to GitHub and archived in the institutional repository. The peer review process has been really fun. We've actually tried to expand it recently to people even beyond the network, but really getting feedback from the community. Is this useful? We don't want a manual on what an SPSS file is. There's a manual out there on the file itself. What we want is, how do I treat an SPSS file if I'm curating it? What do I need to look for? What are the properties about this particular file that I'm going to need to pull out, or that I'm going to need to understand in order to ensure that it's usable? And it's going to be different for every data type that we encounter. So these are published on GitHub, as I mentioned, and I just want to show an example from a few. We've got one on SPSS files, as I kept mentioning, and here are some of those suggestions from the primer itself. So with the SPSS file, you could save it as a .por, and it's a question mark. So there's a conversation there, and I'm trying to remember if there were other. I think these notes were coming out of the actual webinar that our primer authors had presented. So this was actually part of the discussion. We also have one on Microsoft Access. This is a common data type that I see in our repository. Of course, there's some proprietary concerns there, and there's a lot of questions about how do you actually demonstrate the relationships of a proprietary database format. And then Microsoft Excel is a really kind of core example. There's a lot of conversation, I think, happening in that primer about whether or not you are doing some of the tidying up of the data. Are you making that data set rectangular? Is it okay to leave it, in a poor quality or not? Jupyter Notebooks. This is a really great example that code is data as well. Code needs curation. So how you treat code differently is explored in this particular primer. And here are some additional topics that are being worked on as we speak. We're hoping to publish these in January. And so far, it's just been a really great opportunity to provide this platform for those of us, all of the experts in our community who have these skills and subject knowledge to really present that back out in a way that can be cited, in a way that is recognized. And we encourage others to get on board. So definitely contact us if you're interested. We've got a lot of opportunities. The next topic I wanted to just briefly explore is some of the research that we've been doing in the Data Curation Network. I think it's always been our intention to really explore this space to see, does data curation make a difference? I think that's kind of one of the core questions that we wrote into our program. As I mentioned, we've been exploring kind of the importance of data curation, the importance of the activities, and I think we've seen a really positive response to that. But does it make a difference? Does the time and the effort and the people and the staff and the technology involved make a difference? It's timeout. So I'll just keep going. The value of curation is a very difficult topic to address, No two data sets are the same. So it's really hard to put them in an experimental environment and curate one and not the other, and to see which one gets used more or to see which one is more useful. But we've been trying to assess a number of different methodologies to help us figure out how can we really approach this question in an empirical way and get to the heart of this. And one possible approach that we're really exploring right now is how to validate the metadata. So looking at the metadata of a particular data set, can we say that the metadata is more complete or less complete? What is our standard for completeness? So that's kind of where we've been focusing some time and attention to and want to engage the community about. And then in the future, how are we really positioning data curation services within the broader suite of research data management? I know many in the room here, when we had our workshop, are RDM librarians, RDM service providers. Data curation is a piece of that RDM puzzle, but what does that look like in relation to the rest of our services? Thank you. The next thing I'm going to talk about is just our sustainability plan. So I think this is a real relative interest to the group here because it's a very difficult question. As I mentioned, you can get a group of your closest colleagues in a room together and come up with a plan and all stick to it. But as you keep growing and you keep expanding, you lose that initial sense of community and you become a new type of community. And how to grow that has been a real challenge for us, or how to anticipate that growth, I think, has been a challenge for us because we're not growing too fast yet. So this has been our plan up until now. So we are in our implementation phase. We're in year 2 of a 3-year grant. And we have onboarded 2 new partners this year, as we intended to, because we really had intended to grow incrementally, adding on a few partners at a time, particularly thinking about where are our gaps in expertise versus the data sets that we're curating. But then we hope to transition to something else once the grant is complete. We want to be able to grow and sustain this project and ensure that others can gain access to these types of services. The question, of course, is how. We are trying to answer that question in a number of ways. We had a sustainability panel or an advisory panel at our 2019 All Hands meeting. And some of you might recognize one of them, hopefully, or if not all, where we really wanted to hear back from other experts in the field who've been doing this and who've been thinking about these things to help us understand, are we on the right track? And what should we be thinking about? And it was really interesting to get the outside perspectives for us, because we always sort of felt like we just need to keep growing in order to be successful. But maybe success isn't just keeps growing. Maybe success is we get better at what we do with what we've got. So it really challenged us to think differently about how we are measuring our success. The other thing we have done is through an RFP process, we've hired a consultant, the Lyricist Group, to work with us to understand a variety of administrative structures and models that might be appropriate for this type of work. And I mention that because there's some evidence to show through our focus groups and through our discussions with other projects like this, that the membership model, at least in the United States context, it can be fatiguing, and institutions aren't necessarily interested in paying $5,000 or $10,000 every year after year after year. So are there other models that we should be looking at to really approach this in a way that will position us for success? One of those models is a hybrid, and this is something that our group has been discussing for a couple of years now, and something we're actually kind of putting into practice as we speak, because each of us is an institution that is providing in-kind contribution. So if I put in, through my team, we put in 20 hours in the month of August. Does that mean that we get 20 hours back of curation time from everybody else? Does that mean that our membership fee goes down by whatever that 20 hours might equal in dollars? So really thinking about how can you create an economy around expertise and the value add that the curators are providing. The other thing we're talking about is providing data curation to end users as a fee-for-service model. This is something that might be of interest to institutions that don't have a data curator, who won't ever have a data curator, who need data curation skills and services, but that's just not in the cards. So are there ways that we can provide with our additional capacity, because we're not at capacity currently, are there ways that we can provide that end service to those institutions? The question then, of course, has to come back to the curators, because I think the curators never started this job to be in the business of making curation happen for anybody who has a dollar. So how do we ensure that we are really kind of protecting our vision and protecting our mission by expanding and broadening? And this has been a really interesting challenge for us, because we really have to sort of question our sustainability motivations. Are we doing this just so we can make sure that our data are well curated? Or are we doing this to make sure all data are well curated? It's going to be a different answer from each individual. And so that as a community, I think has been really exciting to explore. And it just opens up just a lot of really deep conversations, frankly, about what do we want our profession to be. And that kind of leads into this what's next question. And these are just some of the things that we've been mulling around and that have been coming back to us that I would present to you to think about as well. That first one is advocacy. And I've sort of mentioned this throughout my talk, that we want to be advocates for why data curation is important, but also advocates for that data curator role, and to never forget the people behind this process, because they are really there for a purpose, and if we don't continue to understand that purpose and to encourage all of those carrots and incentives, we might just not have a program at all. The other question is around consultancy. We have an expertise network for curating data types. We also have expertise in other things. We have expertise in setting up data repositories for a variety of technical solutions. Is that something we would want to maybe go do site visits to work on, how you can get this workflow to work for you, or how to make Jira work the way you want it. So it's really possible to expand out some of the roles that we might play. But again, thinking about those motivations. Domain repositories came up earlier today. It's a really important, I think, question about how we are curating data, because the homogeneity of data curation happening within our domain repositories is different from general data repositories. So in terms of partnership, we need to ensure that the incentives are there on both sides. And so I think this is important because of that give and take model that at least the Data Curation Network has been exploring. So if we're only curating data sets from a domain repository that they don't have the local expertise for, it creates like a different set of expectations from the rest of the Data Curation Network partners. So that's something we really want to test out with various domain repositories to see where that reciprocity might appear. And then can we also just be a professional data curation community? And I think this question really comes out of the institutions that have approached the Data Curation Network and said, we're also doing data curation. We don't think we want to participate in terms of curating your data, but maybe we could just hang out sometimes and talk about things. That role of bringing together the community to establish standards, or just being more informal in sharing knowledge. And is that our role to play? Is that somebody else's role to play? We're not quite sure yet. We are also obviously very happy to work with you in any way or shape that you see could be useful. We are not we don't want to be the Data Curation Network with a capital T. We are a Data Curation Network, and we're trying our best to figure it out, and we would love to share, obviously what we've been going through, but also learn from you and continue to partner. So I have no idea if that worked in terms of time, but...
Yep, that's good. 15 minutes.
Okay, good. Well, that's all we got.
So Lisa, you're on the spot here with the questions. Here we go.
How do we show the value and return on investment of curating research data? Exactly. So I mentioned a couple ideas, and maybe I'll go into detail about one more. So when we look at a well-curated data repository, I think those of us who've been doing this for a while, we can spot the differences. We can really kind of see this data set has appropriate documentation. This data set does appear to have enough contextual information to relate it to the larger body of work. We can also see when a data set does not have some of those things, where it appears to be a conundrum, just doesn't seem to have enough information to actually reuse it. So one of the ideas we have is to actually test out this with real researchers in terms of like a hackathon type event, where we present them with various data sets and hopefully data sets from their own domain and their own field, and ask them about the reusability of these data sets and be able to test it with real people. This idea was used for reproducibility. Lisa Federer, the NIH, the National Library for Medicine, actually did this for a reproducibility hackathon to test, can you reproduce this data? So similarly for data curation, we can maybe test out the value of curation in sort of an experimental laboratory setting like that. Otherwise, that return on investment piece is the long-term question. If we really look at a data set's value over time, I think it'd be hard to predict. Is this going to be of use? Is all the time and effort and work we put into it today going to actually pay out in the long run? Maybe this person becomes a Nobel Prize winner and this is the best data set ever, or maybe they don't. So we really have a lot of things to learn, and I'm really interested in trying to explore that question with all of you, because I don't think there's a good answer. Is my supervisor going to be okay with me working on messy data sets from institutions that are not my home institution? Great question. Not without a really good understanding of what we're trying to do. So one of the big steps in our sustainability process is to come up with a memorandum of understanding or some sort of agreement that we all as data curation network institutions can sign, and that includes the supervisor, but maybe also the dean or the director, that we are agreeing to do this as a partner. So this is not just a fly by the night, you just do this on your spare time or when you go home type of thing. This should be part of your job, and you should get credit for it. So by really paying attention, I think, to those incentives that are already existing for our data curators, we are going to build that in to those agreements across the institutions. Right now, we're held together by grant obligations. So we all have time and effort being tracked on this, and it has to be tracked and accounted for, and everybody gets credit for that. What happens when the grant is no longer there? So that's a huge issue, and we have to ensure that your supervisor will not get mad, because the data sets will be messy and will take a long time.
In a similar vein, and you alluded to this in your presentation, is about the equitability of people's work.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps there's a Curation expert in a field that's very popular right now, they get all the requests, whereas somebody else in a geology, some area isn't very hot at the moment.
Yeah.
Well, they're just sitting there twiddling their thumbs.
Absolutely.
And yet both institutions are paying the same amount to be part of this network. How do you ensure that this workload is equitable?
So how do you ensure that the workload across the institutions is fair? And that's exactly what we're doing right now, and by tracking the time put in. And that's why I think for our ultimate model that we roll out post-grant, it needs to include that recognition of the time commitment comes off the top of whatever membership fee there might be, if that's the model we choose. But I don't think you can always account for it. Right now we have a lot of social science data curator expertise. But social science data might not be coming to the repositories that we present. It might be going to ICPSR or another data repository, which is great. So I think we will always see those imbalances, and what we need to do is really be cognizant of them and aware of them, and ensure that we make other opportunities for people to contribute in different ways. There's a number of subgroups I didn't go into that our curators are also working on. So they could be doing research in different areas or exploring interest groups like what we have here around different data topics. Another question. Strategies for librarians working in institutions where admin have no interest in data management. One of the activities, we didn't do it today, but we typically do in our workshops, is a elevator speech activity where we ask everybody in the room to think about that person, whether it's the AVP, the dean, cranky researcher, whomever. Think about that conversation they need to have and come up with your elevator speech. Tell them why data curation is important. And I think it's a really important exercise for us each to go through, because there's this topic of data curation is maybe conflated or confused or meshed with other types of similar topics. So it is kind of hard. We all think of something different when we talk about data curation. And so coming up with that clear elevator speech is really important. And the broader data management issue, yeah, I think it's a challenge. There's a lot of questions, I think, in our field about what we're doing, but essentially I always fall back on the fact that our library, at least that's where I'm working, I'm in the library context, is the leader on our campus in these topics. And because of that, we're having conversations campus-wide. Because of that, we have a data management policy. And so if we hadn't have started those conversations and been at that table, I really don't think we would have gotten to where we are today.
Just a suggestion on that one, I would say do it anyway. Do it directly with the researcher, and maybe pick the candidate research chair or a researcher that has a high profile, and show the value to your admins by doing it and allowing the researcher to also back up the value prop.
That's a great advice. Do it anyway. Oh, yeah. How are you tracking the impact or reuse of the curated data sets? Whew. So, tracking impact and reuse of data is very hard. We can see the number of downloads. Are those people downloads? Are those machine downloads? Those are questions I have. We can see perhaps the citation of the data, if it is appropriately cited. Sometimes data are just mentioned in the methods section. So there are a number of competing issues here with trying to track the impact and the reuse of curated data sets. Right now in the Data Curation Network, we have not found a solution for that particular problem. We are tracking a lot of metrics. We're tracking how much time goes into the curation process. We're tracking even all of the statistics about how the curation work happens. But once it gets released out into the wild, that's where it becomes much more difficult, and we're looking across the local institutions that we all do it differently. So it would even be hard to compare across our local repositories. So we don't have a good answer. I don't have an answer. Does anybody? Yeah?
But Levi CPSR does some
Right.
tracking, and they've got the horsepower to do that, but they actually have people go out and brute force, and maybe through some scripts and bots and such, search for ICPSR data in the literatures, and then bring that back and incorporate it into an online bibliography.
Undergraduate students also helpful in that area.
I think it's important to have that piece of the plan in place, because it feeds into then talking to people about putting the time into it, right? So it definitely having that plan in place is so important.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of really great projects too, happening. Make Data Count is one example, and having ROAR statistics attached to the repository is another way.
I do have statistics that would help you there. I have heard recently that articles that are published and with their data sets accompanying that are cited 25% more than articles that don't have data sets.
Oh, great.
Doesn't tell us whether they're curated or not, but at least data, that's the carrot that you're supposed to.
Beyond like impacts on the data itself, are you noticing like changes in researcher behavior? So like those connections provide opportunities for teachable moments. Do you notice improvements in data?
Absolutely. Yeah. Do we notice improvements with researcher behavior? Yes, that's the most exciting part of my day really is when I get a repeat customer, a return submitter, and the data is so much better, and they are using our README file template, and it's just a very simple process. It really does make a difference. So yeah, absolutely. I think when we're doing the curation steps, it's a form of that hands-on, opportunity to engage with that workshop of one around how to create a good data set. Yeah. More? Okay. Ideally, how much curatorial effort should the researcher put in before the package comes into the repositories team? I see bottlenecks. There are lots of bottlenecks, and curatorial effort, ideally, there would be an amazing process to collect the data in such a way that all of our answers would be addressed right there initially. That's not usually going to happen, though. So I actually wanted to refer back to the article that was mentioned earlier in the Scholarly Kitchen that Roger wrote around this dichotomy of we have this publisher policies to share the data, and then we have this broader need of researchers needing to access the actual data that is produced by the community. And so I think this question should be seen in that context, because I think a lot of my researchers are coming to us for that first problem. They want to publish their data because they're being told to by their journal. So not a lot of effort has gone into it because they're just meeting a policy, they're meeting a mandate. And in fact, I don't know how much effort we want to put into it sometimes, because it's just a subset of the really important data that exists somewhere else. It's just the data behind their graphs. And for reproducibility purposes, obviously, yes, this is great news. But there is a bigger issue at stake, that the rest of that data is not interoperable with the other data produced by that community. So we're piecemealing it. We're cutting it up into tiny bits, and we're just kind of throwing it out everywhere, including into my repository. So how do we address this larger question of maybe not packaging them up so small and so tight, and thinking about that process, from beginning to end. I don't think it's as easy, though, as just saying we should do that. I work on data management plans all the time. Just this week, we worked on a data management plan where the group wants to create a potato data repository. There's a lot of great research going on potatoes, right? It's about the genomics, it's about the agricultural, the soil samples. It's all really, very dispersed, different types of data. Bringing those all together is a huge challenge. Now, do we want to see that spread across all the different repositories out there, or wouldn't it be great to bring it all together into one community? And even just starting that question of, well, how are you actually going to build this data repository was, it's a difficult question. It's kind of buried in the grant proposal somewhere. I mean, their focus is on the research. So how much curatorial effort? Well, a lot. But I think it is something that we each need to talk more about the process of curation, not as a means to an end, not as meeting your grant, not as meeting your funder requirements, not as meeting your journal requirements, but thinking about how can we make this data reusable overall, and think about how we do this differently, and not let the scholarly communication system sort of take over data publishing as well.
Okay, that's it.
Oh, good. I get to go down now. Okay.
Yeah. That's fantastic. And thank you for the barrage of questions. Mentimeter is fantastic. I just teed up question after question. So that was a really great presentation, and I think the experience of the Data Curation Network is something that we all can reflect on as we continue to have these conversations over the next 2 days. It's been a long day, but we do want to have one more activity before we let you go. So this is sort of a wrap-up discussion, 30-minute lightning round. So if you look on your name tags and you look in the back, you have a mysterious number that I'll now explain. So that number refers to your group. We're going to get together with our groups and find a space for your discussions. So groups 1, 2, 3, and 4 are here, and groups 5 and 6 are downstairs in 111. So in groups, you'll be asked to respond to 2 questions. presented in our shared Google Doc found here in this bit.ly link. The bit.ly link is also written downstairs on the whiteboard, so you can access it. Each group will have a facilitator from the program committee. So that facilitator will be responsible for kind of guiding the discussion and also doing some note taking to capture the responses on the Google Docs. And so the two questions are as follows. So one, what are the main barriers or challenges to data curation activities within your organization and in your work? And two, what are the key elements of a national approach that address these barriers and challenges? These are big questions. It's been a long day, but it's just sort of a good chance to get you started thinking about it. And we're going to be exploring these in greater depth tomorrow.